So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Lee Gettler. He's an assistant research professor in the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on the way in which men's hormonal physiology responds to major life transitions, such as marriage and fatherhood. He particularly focuses on the ways in which men's hormones accommodate the demands of new parenthood, such as childcare, including on a minute-to-minute basis. He uses both evolutionary and social theoretical approaches to help contextualize his findings, providing insights into the ways in which it has been shaped by our evolutionary past, as well as how it is responding to cultural contexts. He's a delightful fellow with a new baby, so please welcome him now.
Darcy, do you want me to try to do a half an hour? No? Oh, it's only 11. Got it. Got it. Thank you, Darsha, for that kind invitation. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, so this is kind of my honest scientist moment, I suppose. When the program was kind of recirculated to us, I looked at it and I said, that's the title I submitted? That looks like the kind of culmination of my career talk that I hope to give in 30 or 40 years. So I modified this a little bit. This slide is now an opportunity for me to, there's two things going on here. One, I'm only really talking about fatherhood. So thankfully, Dr. Feldman gave us such a nice overview of all of her really rich research that it's kind of more explicitly looked at familial systems and parenthood on a broader level with both mothers and fathers. I have scaled down the text in terms of which of those terms or which of those kind of perspectives I'm going to hit on most. I'll primarily be talking about human evolution and how that kind of shapes some of the questions we've been able to ask with our data from the Philippines. And then this is just an opportunity for me to show a bunch of pictures of me collecting my own saliva at the hospital after my son was born, after I engaged in skin-to-skin contact. So there's probably a whole slew of ways we could think of my talk. Maybe it's just a familial slideshow and I could look at my own testosterone as we circulate through the pictures, but hopefully it'll be good. Okay, so I think many of the talks that we've seen the past couple days have been focused on how a little developing human infant like my son moves through his life course to eventually become potentially a father himself, and this is my father and that's me, and so we're coming full circle here. But thinking about father-to-child effects, how did my father affect me as an infant, and how is that going? How is my own developmental trajectory maybe going to affect my parenting and the intergenerational transfers in that way? Now, what the last two talks have really highlighted is the way that children are kind of active agents in their familial systems, and the extent to which they themselves can affect their parents. And so this is really the kind of perspective I take so far in my own research, is thinking about how interacting with children, how the transition to fatherhood, how men's interactions with their partners really affect them biologically. So we can think of this as the biology of fatherhood. And then later in the talk, towards the end, assuming I get there, because I think this is the morning of all of us having too many slides, but I'm gonna try to get to the end of my talk as well. I'm gonna discuss some new work that some new research I'm working on here at Notre Dame with Dr. Julie Braungart-Riekert and Dr. Mark Cummings, both of whom we've already seen present in previous days. So stepping back for a second, as an anthropologist and as a biological anthropologist specifically, I want to give you a little perspective on why we might ask whether fathers biologically respond to parenthood at all, thinking about this from an evolutionary and a phylogenetic perspective. And human life history, broadly construed, is unusual. So the way we reproduce, the frequency with which we produce children, as compared to many of our closest relatives, is relatively rare, unusual, unique. We wouldn't expect it to kind of evolve the way that it has. So walking through some of that, in this first column you see age at first birth, comparing humans to our closest relatives. I've highlighted the fact that on average, in natural fertility populations, human females might reproduce for the first time at about age 19 or 20, whereas in chimpanzees, that's about age 13. So using this as kind of a broad marker of adult maturation, you can see that we're maturing much later. And then if you look at our weaning ages, our weaning age compared to our closest relatives is much earlier. So if we just think about the breadth of time between that age 3 and that age 19, that's a substantial period in which our children might be relying on external care. In chimpanzees and our other great ape relatives, their offspring are independent at weaning. So they no longer, for the most part, receive at least energetic assistance from their mothers. So this is a very different kind of developmental trajectory comparing humans to our closest relatives, the great apes. Looking at this another way, this is a growth trajectory, growth velocity curve from a foraging population in South America. If we look at their growth, or a human growth trajectory curve compared to a chimpanzee growth trajectory curve, you can see there's this flat period, this period in which our growth rate really bottoms out, and that would be childhood, right? So this is actually a relatively kind of unique phase in terms of development. When we think about life history and kind of the pace at which we develop, compared to chimpanzees and other great apes, they don't have this same kind of bottoming out of their growth trajectory curve. It's more of a steady increase. So this is a relatively kind of unique developmental event or developmental set of years that emerges during human evolution. And the question is, how are we able to get there? How are we able to have this kind of protracted period of dependence? And this is a nice, really elegant set of research from Dr. Karen Kramer. And what I really want you to see here is that the gray bars are really indicating kind of reliance, the child's absolute reliance on external care, on external productivity within the familial household economy. And it's not until they get to 16 or 17 that in this subsistence level economy, the children, the teenagers are starting to become net producers, where they're actually contributing to the household economy, not just energetically, but in terms of labor and productivity, above their own consumption. So again, thinking back to comparisons to our other great ape relatives, this is a very, very unique kind of developmental trajectory, and it suggests that there's this prolonged period of childhood where human offspring are really dependent on external care. Now, if we think about how often we produce our offspring, again, natural fertility populations, we see that our interbirth intervals, our spaces between our births, assuredly went down. The space between births dropped during human evolution, probably from a more chimpanzee-like reproductive trajectory to what we see, something in the range of what we see in natural fertility populations today. And then if we look at offspring survival, in contemporary foragers, just using them as kind of an exemplar of the type of mortality rates we see under natural circumstances, non-industrialized circumstances today, we see that there's a much higher rate of survival in contemporary foragers relative to chimpanzees, with offspring making it to through juvenility at a higher rate. So what does all this mean? We oftentimes refer to this as kind of the paradox of human life history. From a phylogenetic life history, evolutionary perspective, we would not expect or predict that this suite of characteristics sort of. Evolutionary or traditionally, dating back to kind of the man, the hunter model that Dr. Hilary Fouts referred to yesterday, fathers and kind of a nuclear family model was thought to be really important to the evolution of this life history. Now, in recent decades, we've seen the emergence of these cooperative breeding models that have really expanded the scope of this discussion beyond fathers to include individuals such as older siblings, that's Karen Kramer's work again, and then the grandmother hypothesis, which many of you are probably familiar with, has really given us some sense of the broader scope of alloparenting, the contributory roles that many individuals make beyond the immediate parents, and in particular have really highlighted this question of whether fathers were especially reliable, which I'll come back to in a couple slides. So this has raised the issue, this question of whether fathers were terribly reliable has raised the issue as to whether paternal care and kind of a mother-father cooperative dynamic in raising children is really an evolved human trait. Is this something that was particularly critical to human evolution? Or is it more of a modern invention since kind of humans began to settle down in more kind of permanent settlement patterns, things of that nature. So when we look across species, again, what we see is that among our great ape relatives, there's no paternal care. If we look at the genera level, so here we have our great apes, and then if we expand out to look at the primate order in general, you can see the blue indicates where a genus where fathers help to take care of young. And you can see this is incredibly rare across the primate order. Most genera with paternal care in the primate order are kind of situated within that New World monkey taxonomic category. So what this suggests is that there's not a phylogenetic history of primate males investing in their young. Humans do not have a deep evolutionary history of perhaps having the underlying neurobiology and hormonal physiology to help support paternal care, and that there may have been very specific selective pressure in the course of human evolution to shape our neurobiology to help facilitate this type of care. One of the challenges here in terms of thinking about what fathers were doing and answering this question about human evolution is simply that we are very limited by the lines of evidence available to us. We can look at cross-cultural data in contemporary human populations. We can look at changes in body mass. We can look at shifts in sexual dimorphism as to what, in the course of human evolution, and what that might tell us about how males and females were interacting with one another and how males were competing with other males for opportunities to partner with females. And we can look at the material record. But unfortunately, we don't see much evidence of paternal investment in the material record. There, to my knowledge, we've not yet found the ergo baby carrier in the archaeological record dating back to Australopithecines or early Homo, nor the kind of father-specific bathing bin, right? So we're very limited by the lines of evidence available to us as to how we can formulate models in terms of what fathers may have been doing and whether they were especially critical to the evolution of this human life history. So the perspective that I've tried to bring to bear on this is that if we look across taxonomic lines, not just limited to primates or mammals, but looking more broadly across vertebrates, is that you see where biparental care, so shared care between mothers and fathers evolves, you tend to get, you get selective pressure on male neurobiology to respond to fatherhood and respond to investment in young in fairly predictable ways, although there is quite a bit of diversity across these kind of broad phylogenetic categories. But oftentimes what you see is that when males are cooperating to raise young, when their offspring are highly dependent, their testosterone goes down, and another hormone, peptide protein hormone, prolactin, goes up. This has been, from a life history theory and a parental investment theory perspective, this has been pitched in terms of testosterone as being a hormone that promotes mating and prolactin as being a hormone that promotes parenting in males. Following some recent theoretical contributions from Dr. Sari Van Anders, I think it's useful, particularly in terms of human psychobiology, to think about testosterone as a hormone that's potentially promoting competition, with mating behaviors oftentimes kind of falling into that umbrella term, or the way we think about competitive behavior, and then low testosterone kind of correlating to hormones that fall more under a pro-nurturance description. And one of the things Van Anders is really trying to do here is point out the fact that testosterone, particularly, low testosterone is not ubiquitously found in the context of parenting, because parenting is a highly demanding and diffuse kind of category of behavior that oftentimes requires challenge, vigilance, competition, and nurturance. So you can get high testosterone and low testosterone in the context of parenting. So I think this is a rich theoretical context for us to try to think about the nature of paternal physiology in humans. So what do we see? Is there a basis for asking this question in human males based on kind of the existing literature on testosterone's role, particularly in male behavior? And what we see, thinking about kind of psychobiology broadly, is that there is a relationship between elevated testosterone and kind of increased occurrence of each of these bullet points I have here. Now, the effect sizes relating testosterone to, say, aggressive behavior or competitive behavior in human males or females is not as strong as it is in other non-human species, and other mammals, other primates. But you do see this kind of stereotypical effect of testosterone in terms of increasing competition. And then, rather than increasing aggression, it seems to play out, have this specific kind of neurobiological effect in terms of impacting the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which we've heard quite a bit about, which can really kind of prime humans for reactive aggression when they are exposed to things like status threats and dominance challenges. So in terms of thinking about how this might play out in human fathers, we can bear in mind this sort of suite of behaviors that collectively may not all individually be all that strongly related to testosterone, but as a broad suite of behaviors, we could conceptualize a way in which this might be disadvantageous evolutionarily for males who are trying to invest on a consistent basis in dependent offspring. On the flip side of this, we actually know far less about how low testosterone correlates to men's behavior. But what we see is that in some experimental lab paradigms, mostly conducted by Dr. Alison Fleming, Dr. Ann Story, and recently great research coming out of Dr. Feldman's lab by Weissman and colleagues, have shown these indicators that low testosterone in fathers may actually help promote kind of a sensitive nurturant phenotype through which we could envision child development and perhaps child survival in ancestral environments being promoted by fathers who have low testosterone or fathers who are able to downregulate their testosterone during that really kind of critical period of infancy and childhood. Okay, so when, probably many of you are familiar with this, when we're talking about testosterone production, we're talking about the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So you get GnRH released from the brain, which travels to the pituitary, stimulates LH, which then travels to the testes and stimulates the Leydig cells to produce testosterone, which then can feed back and cross the blood-brain barrier to affect mood and cognition and behavior. I'm also pointing this out because I think, and I haven't been able to test this because I'm working kind of under naturalistic conditions and not working with individuals that we're placing in an fMRI in a way that is comparable to what Dr. Feldman has highlighted for us. But if there's truly kind of a down-regulating effect of fathers or men becoming fathers and fathers interacting with their kids, my hypothesis is that it's taking place at the level of the brain, that we're getting kind of translation of those social, emotional, physical proximity, touch. Though these sorts of sensory and emotional cognitive processes are probably affecting those GnRH neurons in the hypothalamus, perhaps through signaling mechanisms like kisspeptin, neurokinin B, dynorphin, other opiates that we know can affect GnRH production and then have a down-regulatory a regulatory effect on testosterone production. Okay, so what do we know about testosterone in human fatherhood, kind of leading into the work that we've been able to do in the Philippines? There had been a number of smaller cross-sectional studies that had shown cross-cultural variation in the extent to which fathered and partnered men had low testosterone than non-partnered, or than non-fathers, pardon me. However, they were cross-sectional and they were small, and so there was a number of kind of limitation in terms of trying to determine whether the transition to fatherhood led to declines in men's testosterone and perhaps affected their behavior, or whether it was low testosterone men being more likely to become fathers and subsequently kind of maintaining a low testosterone phenotype as they move through the parenting process. And as I just highlighted, there was some evidence prior to our work that suggested that paternal care and men's involvement in paternal care, both within a given cultural context and across cultures, may have been predictive of whether fathers had lower testosterone than non-fathers. So my research has primarily been conducted in Metro Cebu in the Philippines. Metro Cebu is the second largest city in the Philippines behind Manila. The study itself is the Cebu Longitudinal Health and Nutrition Survey. I will probably just refer to it as the Cebu study. Dr. Quinn described this a little bit yesterday, but in 1983, this birth cohort study enrolled around 3,300 pregnant women. Those infants that were born in 83 and 84 have subsequently been followed at many different time points throughout their lives. I work on the male wing of the Cebu Longitudinal Health and Nutrition Survey. So these are, there's historical circumstances as to why we don't have kind of comparable testosterone and behavioral data on the female wing of the study. I would love to have it, but we don't. So I'm working with men who are around 21 and a half and 26 years old. So early to kind of young to kind of mid-adulthood in their 20s here. Cebu is located in the central Visayas region, and what I'm trying to highlight here with this kind of extract is that this study was designed as a population representative study of this metropolitan area, so we have a very diverse sample. In 1983, there was around 1,650 males enrolled in the study, and as of 2009, we had roughly 900 men still enrolled. And again, while we've lost some of the kind of lower SES, there's been more attrition among individuals of kind of low socioeconomic status. The study and the sample remains quite diverse, so we have a nice pseudo-representative sample of this multi-million person metro area. So in terms of thinking about whether this is an appropriate question, does testosterone change as men become fathers in Cebu? I just want to highlight a few kind of data points we have in terms of thinking about how fatherhood in Cebu may be shifting, how do men conceptualize their roles, what might they be doing. We did some preliminary qualitative interviews with men as I was beginning my research here. And what we see is there's a bit of an increased fatherly focus on caregiving, which runs kind of against the grain of contemporary or historical models of masculinity in this cultural context. So if men are taking care of their children in this hands-on physical manner on a day-to-day basis, they're really kind of running the risk of having their masculinity questioned, to be frank. So when we qualitatively interview men in this context and ask them about the role of fathers, they immediately identify provider and breadwinner as kind of the primary roles, along with serving as kind of the moral compass of the household that fathers should serve. But if you kind of delve a little deeper with them, quite a few fathers express the desire to be more emotionally available to their children. A number of men expressed the fact that their fathers were kind of cold and not really responsive to them when they were kids. And so we're seeing kind of an increased desire for some fathers to be involved with their children. So as one might expect, we kind of have a range of variation in how much child care men are reporting to us. If we look at just some simple kind of Likert scale questions in terms of how men are reporting perceptions of shared roles in the household, most men report that caregiving should be kind of equally shared between mom and dad. On the other hand, if we ask them why they're performing child care, a huge proportion of them report that they're doing it specifically to help out their partner, kind of indicating that the child care role is really the explicit kind of maternal domain. Rather than viewing this as kind of some sort of negatively connotated set of responses, I think it just highlights the importance of thinking about this in a family system perspective. The role that men, I think men take some pride in the fact that when they're engaging in childcare, they're really helping out their partner. So thinking about the dynamics of how this is actually playing out on the ground in Cebu, I think is an important thing for us to keep in mind as I move through some of these results. And then what you can see is that if we ask men how many hours of daily childcare they're providing, they look like the world's most involved fathers. Part of this has to do with kind of translational issues and how the question translates to Cebuano, the local language. This daily childcare encompasses kind of a term that includes proximity. So some of this is them being in close proximity to their children. And then there's also a component of this that has to do with employment. There's a rampant unemployment in Cebu in general for men and women, but actually women are better able to get kind of jobs that can help sustain the family. So males who aren't able to get jobs tend to be taking care of their kids more if they have them. So actually we get a high preponderance of, or a reasonably high preponderance of unemployed men in that category on the far right. So coming back to this slide, we're just, again, highlighting that we're looking at men between the ages of 21 and a half and 26. So our sample size, our total sample size is around 900 men in terms of who we have testosterone on in 2009. We have a much smaller sample of men who are single non-fathers at age 21. So that's what this 465 refers to. And I'll kind of walk through the logic here of why we're starting with that sample. The major question we're asking here is, as you transition to fatherhood, does your testosterone decline? To answer this question, and to really kind of stratify based on whether it's partnering that's driving down testosterone or whether it's fatherhood that's driving down testosterone, you have to start with a sample of men who have not partnered or become fathers, right? So there's our 465 men. They're all single non-fathers at age 21. And you can see that they move through these life history transitions kind of in various ways with a large, over half the sample remaining single non-fathers at age 26. And then men becoming married in their 20s and not having children relatively immediately is kind of rare, which is why the partner non-fathers is a relatively low percentage if, comparatively to, say, the United States. So what I'm going to walk you through here is just a chart that will show the AM waking testosterone values and the evening testosterone values for these three groups. On the far left, you have the men who are single non-fathers at both time points. In the middle, you have the men who become partnered but don't have children. And on the far right, you have the men who become newly partnered new fathers. I will show this in a kind of more digestible way in a subsequent slide. But what I want to highlight here is the fact that these men who become newly partnered new fathers actually have higher testosterone when they're single non-fathers. So that runs explicitly counter to the idea that men with low testosterone are the ones who are more likely to become fathers. And this kind of, again, jives well with evolutionary theory in terms of thinking about how testosterone might motivate males to compete for partners, how it potentially might make them more attractive as partners. But what we see here, actually, and this is a significant effect, although the effect size is not terribly large, that testosterone, as being poured from our milk carton here, leads you to become the world's #1 dad. This is actually when we originally published these results, they showed up in the media a bit, and someone sent me this image that was covering our work, which is actually kind of fundamentally misunderstands what we actually found, but it sort of demonstrates this point, so I'm including it here. So what we see if we just look at absolute decline in testosterone is graded variation. Okay, so if you stay a single non-father, even in your mid-20s, you experience a mild age-related decline in testosterone. If you become a newly partnered man but don't have a child, you have an intermediate decline. And if you become a newly partnered new father, you have a particularly large decline. And I'm not showing these results here, but that effect is especially heightened based on infant age. So the decline in testosterone is particularly large for men with young infants. This is a new paper that we have under review. We were recently, my Filipino collaborators and I recently figured out a way to extract residence data, so whether fathers were living with their children when they were 21 and a half. It was not explicitly asked, so it took us quite a bit of time to figure out how to get this out of our survey instruments. But what we see quickly is that shifting either becoming a new father and living with your children, or if you're an existing father and not living with your children but transition to living with them, both of those shifts cause large declines in testosterone. Now this is obviously looks like a fairly astronomically large decline. There's only 10 men in that category, so I think we need to be a little bit cautious about interpreting group 2 too extremely. But in group 4, what you see is those are the men who are non-fathers, they're non-fathers at baseline, so when they're 21, and then they become residential new fathers at follow-up. And so their testosterone is declining substantially, both in terms of waking and evening testosterone. But I'd also point out, I can't get the clicker to work, but that we see in group 3. So group 3 are men who are non-fathers at baseline but becoming new fathers and not living with their kids. Their testosterone also declines, at least in the evening. So that's somewhat statistically accounted for by changes in partnering status in the models. So when you plug in Did you become newly married? Did you become newly divorced? That becomes a statistical trend, but I think it highlights the fact that this transition to fatherhood may be affecting men in diverse ways that aren't absolutely accounted for either by childcare or proximity. So kind of one of the big questions, so we've documented these demographic level patterns. I think one of the logical questions that comes out of this is whether this seems to have any effect on behavior. So we also asked the question whether testosterone is lower among men who provide childcare. Again, men slotted themselves into these categories. I presented this slide, or the percentages of men who are in those slides a few slides back. And what we see here is that men who perform the most childcare have the lowest evening testosterone. This is robust to controls for things like psychosocial stress and sleep time. And so even though a reasonable number of these men are unemployed, so there could potentially be some stress issues there. We're controlling for psychosocial stress. So this looks fairly robust. In a subsequent paper, we were able to look at co-sleeping, so whether men were sleeping on the same surface as their children. They don't really sleep in beds in the same way that we kind of conceptualize them here. So I think using the phrase same surface co-sleeping is a bit safer than bed sharing. This is culturally normative here. So this is important to bear in mind that 92% of our fathers are in this category. So very different from the United States and many other kind of European nations where fathers sharing sleeping surfaces with their infants might be much less common. What we see is, again, with evening testosterone, fathers who co-sleep have lower T. What I'm trying to point to here is the fact that men longitudinally, men who go from being non-fathers to being co-sleeping fathers experience a large decline in T. Men who actually go from being non-fathers to being fathers who sleep away from their kids actually experience an increase in T. Now again, small sample size in the solitary sleepers, so I don't want to overinterpret that too much, but a fairly interesting pattern here. One of the limitations is that these are primarily correlational data, and so it's possible that fatherhood leads to decreasing testosterone, and that increases men's childcare. It's possible that fatherhood leads some men to become involved with childcare, and then that leads to decreasing testosterone. Or it's possible, and I think some of the ways that Dr. Feldman really set up this biobehavioral synchronicity model that she's championed with her work, their work on oxytocin primarily, sets up this question of whether this is a mutually reinforcing cycle. Men who become involved with childcare end up with a modicum of lower testosterone that perhaps sensitizes them to their infant's needs, which creates efficacy in terms of childcare, and then you get this reinforcing loop. This is a little bit difficult to test for, but again, in this paper we currently have under review, we were able to extract time allocation data from our baseline survey when men were 21. And so what we see is if we take weekly hours of childcare when men are 21 and weekly hours of childcare when men are 26, and we look at the fathers' change in childcare, men who become more involved with childcare between the ages of 21 and 26 experience a decline in T. Men who reduce their investment in childcare over that same time frame experience an increase in T. And I've highlighted the effect size here. So a one standard deviation increase in childcare over this 4.5-year period actually leads to about an 11% decline in testosterone. The line looks a little less dramatic because you have that individual at the top who's kind of pulling up the y-axis. But this is we would suspect that this would be biologically meaningful. So again, thinking about that potentially reinforcing effect, we can't necessarily disentangle precipitating cause here, but I think this is suggestive of the idea that you may have this kind of mutually reinforcing process between childcare and men's testosterone. Just to highlight, because I'm only kind of really speaking about my own results, this correlation between low testosterone and men's childcare is actually shown up in a diverse array of cultural settings around the world. Our study in the Philippines, work in Senegal, Tanzania, recent study out of Emory in Atlanta, and then work by Ann Story in Canada. So this seems to be a fairly robust pattern across cultural boundaries. And the work by my colleague Martin Muller is particularly important because he really conducted the first study that suggested that cultural models of fatherhood, what fathers are expected to do, perhaps how men are socialized as parents, how cultural beliefs about productivity, economics, space, when men should interact with kids, these things seem to shape whether fathers have lower testosterone than non-fathers. So Martin compared a pastoralist population and a forager population that share a local ecology, and he found that among the pastoralists, where fathers were not involved or were not in proximity to their children and really didn't interact with them all that much until they became old enough to help with herding, fathers and non-fathers looked the same for testosterone. Whereas in a foraging society, in the exact same ecology, where men frequently take care of their kids and in particular hold them quite a bit when they're in camp, fathers have lower testosterone than non-fathers. So as an anthropologist, I think this is really a brilliant kind of study design and a really important study that gives us a sense for how important kind of cultural models of masculinity, femininity, parenting roles, family systems, et cetera, can really shape how some of these physiological patterns play out on the ground. Okay, so maybe some of you in the room are wondering this. I get asked this question a lot. So father's testosterone's declining, so what about sexual behavior? If you actually backtrack to 2011, I'm sure you could easily find a quote from me that indicates that I did not think that there would be any relationship between changes in testosterone and men's sexual behavior. As a good scientist, we went and tested this with our data. So if we look at this pattern in unmarried non-fathers, what you see is that men who have a larger decline in testosterone report less sexual activity at follow-up, but this isn't significant. When you look at fathers, the pattern becomes more dramatic. So men who transition from being non-fathers to newly partnered new fathers, if their testosterone goes down more, they report having less sex at follow-up. Okay, and this is robust to a number of controls that you might hypothesize would either confound this or help to account for it. So the easy take-home message here, right, based on what I've just shown you, is that fathers who care for their kids have low T and no sex. I was interviewed about this, and this reporter must have said this to me like 17 times. And I kept saying, no. No, we accounted for this. Like, in our models, we explicitly tested for that sort of model, that sort of relationship, and this is not the narrative as to what seems to be going on here. Okay? So the next kind of logical question is that it must be libido. We don't have measures of libido, but what I can tell you, just briefly, is that based on the existing literature, this idea that testosterone really strongly drives libido is a myth. The effect sizes relating testosterone and libido are either like null, as in there's no relationship, or they're incredibly small, despite what Time magazine and the pharmaceutical industry may tell us about menopause. So it's possible that many of the prior studies on libido and testosterone are cross-sectional, whereas our study is longitudinal and within individual. So it's plausible that there is a connection here, and libido is in this pathway, and we're picking it up as a result of tracking the same individuals through time. This kind of leads me into the culmination of my talk, which is that, can anyone identify a limitation of trying to understand how testosterone and men's sexual activity may play out in the context of a family? Who do we have data on? Just the dad, right? Okay, so we don't have family system data. This is me and my partner when we were in the early stages of our pregnancy. So we don't have complex social relationship data between mothers and fathers. We don't have relationship satisfaction data. We don't have we have paternal psychosocial stress. We don't have maternal mental emotional well-being. We don't know how much mothers and fathers are interacting over the course of the day and what those interactions look like. So I think there's a variety of ways. I'm sure the people in this room could help me conceptualize a number of diverse hypotheses about how changes in testosterone might relate to sexual behavior and what could be in that pathway as related to kind of a family systems perspective. We have a current survey going on in Cebu where we are collecting data from men's partners for the first time, and we're also collecting data on children for the first time. So we won't be isolated to just this single node in a family system. But this is, I think, where this research really needs to head. And thankfully, we already had a fantastic talk from Dr. Ruth Feldman, who has highlighted and done so much of the research that really does use this family system model that highlights the intersections both behaviorally, emotionally, and cognitively between partners, but also with the child as an active agent in this family system, and looking at kind of the cross-generational transfers, in particular with oxytocin in her study. And so building off of Dr. Feldman's work, hoping to kind of piggyback on some of the excellent research she has done and look at it in some other hormonal systems. Dr. Julie Braungart-Rieker, Dr. Mark Cummings, and I are collaborating on a project at the Center for Children and Families, and then running our hormones or our saliva samples at my laboratory here at Notre Dame. And some of our key questions are looking at partner interactions, psychosocial stress, emotional health, both in the moment and kind of throughout individuals' history in terms of their relationships to their own parents, and looking at how that relates to their interactions with one another, their relationship satisfaction, and then their psychobiology in terms of things like testosterone, cortisol, and progesterone. And then we're also having both mothers and fathers interact in the still face paradigm, which I think we've heard about in a number of talks, and looking at whether hormonal changes in that kind of moment of interacting with the baby and with each other, as well as baseline hormones that we're having them collect at home, are kind of predictive of paternal sensitivity, infants' emotional regulation capacities, things of that nature. So really trying to kind of expand out this family systems perspective and get a more integrative sense of how all of these different dynamics intersect with one another, and I think highlighting the utility of a real interdisciplinary approach. And then, if I haven't made the point well enough already, Dr. Feldman is really kind of the world's leading expert in terms of integrating both these kind of social, emotional, family system perspectives with really rich psychobiological and neurobiological data. So if I could just summarize briefly, what are some of the take-home points? I've really just spoken about my own research here for the most part, but I think when we expand out to the extent to which the depth of our knowledge on human paternal psychobiology is growing, if we look at a deep phylogenetic perspective comparing humans to other primates, other mammals, other vertebrates, especially birds, these patterns that we've documented really suggest that human males have an evolved but flexible neuroendocrine architecture that allows them to respond to fatherhood, and in particular seems to be capable of attuning into hands-on childcare and kind of the sensitivity and nurturance requirements that go into being an involved parent. And in particular, incorporating or integrating the type of longitudinal data we have from the Philippines with the type of lab-based studies that Dr. Ann Story, Allison Fleming, Ruth Feldman, Sari Van Anders have conducted really suggests that this low testosterone, or this decline in testosterone that we see in our fathers in Cebu, very likely has a nurturance-promoting effect that then can kind of have this reinforcing, cascading process that leads us to have highly invested, low testosterone fathers in the context of Cebu and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you.
Sure.
We'll take a couple questions. One is, or I guess my question is, it's about the baseline for what's normal levels.
Yeah.
It seems that the determination of that has been done on weird populations, right? The people who do all the research. And we, in the weird societies, have men mostly isolated from children most of their lives or most of the time. Mm-hmm. And whereas we know from the studies of the hunter-gatherers, who represent 99% of our history as a genus, men were around kids all the time, or a lot of the time at least, much more than now. So shouldn't really the discussion be about elevated testosterone in the West when you put a man alone in an office and away from children, which is abnormal in human history, And wouldn't it be better to shift it all the other way instead of saying low testosterone to say, ooh, we've got these super high levels in these guys that don't have families or kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, Darsha. First of all, if you do a cross-population comparison, particularly of males living kind of under natural subsistence, under subsistence level conditions where they might be frequently more energetically stressed than what we see in the United States or in Europe, as well as pathogenically stressed developmentally, so they're exposed to many more pathogens and disease. Their testosterone in adulthood is much lower. So Peter Ellison and colleagues published a really great paper on this probably over 10 years ago now, but basically comparing agriculturalists, pastoralists, forager data, whatever they could kind of get their hands on to US levels, and actually looking at age-related trajectories. So this whole idea of menopause is actually probably real in the US, but the idea that this is just the natural physiological function over the course of the human lifespan is totally myopic. So in these other cultures, these subsistence level economies, men's testosterone from basically from puberty almost through their 40s and 50s is more flat. It doesn't decline at this kind of incremental range. And then with a dramatic drop in their 30s and 40s as we see in, say, US populations. So that's one thing. Yes, US industrialized populations are high. They're quite high. And how much that has to do with kind of the social developmental circumstances, how much they're exposed to children. I mean, that certainly hasn't been considered to date, and I think it would be difficult to model. I mean, we could make the argument, right? But one of the things we're trying to look at in Cebu is because we have this birth cohort data, and now that I figured out how to extract this time allocation data, what I just discovered is we have time allocation data from their fathers when they're infants and through the kind of toddler period. So we can actually look at how much their fathers were around and involved with them and see if it's predictive, A, of what they're doing in adulthood behaviorally, but also how their biology may respond to becoming a father. So it wouldn't exactly test what you're suggesting, but I think it would be a starting point for thinking, and I think, again, I'll just keep hitting the Dr. Feldman point home because I have so much respect and admiration for her work. And when I was telling Hillary that when I was in grad school and Dr. Feldman's incredible team kept producing all these studies, I kept thinking, please just keep studying oxytocin and don't study testosterone. So they've only recently published some papers on testosterone, so I was able to get my stuff out before that. But their work looking at kind of the developmental exposures to parents, and both in terms of their biology and their behavior and the intersections of all those things is incredibly rich, and I think would offer a baseline for testing that sort of model. Yeah. Robin?
Sure. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm wondering, and this could be, I mean, you know, tell me if I'm going off on the wrong direction because it's not as relevant, but has anyone thought about issues around depression or shifts in mood in men? So you're looking at this kind of shift in hormonal status in men, right? With several different hormonal proxies, but particularly with testosterone. And we have a really good idea about both kind of socially what's happening with women when they experience postpartum depression, but also hormonal correlates to that. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about men doing an intense amount of parental care, and specifically for the communities that they're in, that it's kind of against this grain, right? Can we think about that at all as happening in men?
About paternal postpartum depression?
Yeah, or just at least depressed mood. You know, I don't know if we want to think about it in a clinical sense, but like a shift in mood.
I think it's also a really excellent question. So what we know from weird populations, and actually I think this study in particular is really weird because it's U.S. military men, not that they're exceptionally weird, just that they're a kind of selected population, but there's a couple of really, really large, rich studies on U.S. military personnel that were done in the 90s by Alan Booth and Mazur. Separate kind of studies looking at different populations. But anyway, testosterone is a U-shaped curve with depression risk, right? As long as you're in kind of the middle range, your depression risk is fairly low. But as you move to the real low end or the real high end, then your risk increases. So again, I think we'd have to think in a complex way about where those cut points might be. Does that model apply to, say, a population in Cebu? I'm not sure, but there's at least a rationale for asking the question. And I do think looking at paternal mood and psychological well-being is important going forward. And we'll have, Julie and Mark and I will have some of those data, and we're looking at families with infants between 5 to 8 months of age. And so certainly in the window where if this low testosterone profile is potentially correlating to maybe adverse mood profiles, we may be able to pick some of it up in cross-section. But I think it's a really legitimate question. Now, like Dr. Weissman, who collaborates with Ruth Feldman, they just published a study looking at whether men's baseline testosterone values predicted kind of sensitive nurturant behavior in the still phase paradigm, in that initial phase where they're just kind of freely exchanging. And I mean, you're getting correlations on the range of 0.4, 0.5 with men who have higher testosterone engage in less infant vocalization, less touch, less kind of all the things that we might think of as being kind of a nurturant paternal phenotype are lower in high testosterone men. Now, I'm just conjecturing, but I would think that if it's the low testosterone fathers that have mood dysregulation, that correlation, that sort of correlation wouldn't really show up as strongly as it does anyway. But I think it's an important question going forward.
2 last quick questions.
It's interesting. I'm from Europe, and this media interest in that men's sexual activity might drop as a result of having lower testosterone. I mean, Feldman also did a study on prolactin and oxytocin in fathers, and prolactin goes up. And one of the functions of prolactin is to reduce libido, as far as I understand. And mothers that are breastfeeding often report that maybe their sexual interest is not that great. So that men having a reduced interest in sex could actually be quite adapted to the relationship surviving, and men not being intensely frustrated about the woman saying constantly no. So that's a slightly different take on it.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I agree with that take. The media, it is challenging. I was not ready for this when I was a grad student, when our work first got into the news, at how negatively it would be pitched. It's probably, well, I was naive. I was a grad student. No offense to any grad students. But yeah, the extent to which I had to act, I mean, I went into the media interviews that Daily Mail article came out of with a very active, like, set of bullet point talking points, knowing what was going to occur when I sat down with them. And so I think that's a really legitimate point, particularly thinking about kind of the deep evolutionary past and how this may have been beneficial. I didn't go through these data, but in Cebu, we actually find that fathers of infants have higher prolactin than non-fathers. Interestingly, among non-fathers, higher prolactin actually relates to more sexual activity. So nothing's ever clean and easy, right? But the idea that prolactin in men is really kind of driving down libido mostly comes out of clinical models of hyperprolactinemia. So if males have kind of like pituitary tumors or something, and their prolactin levels are being driven up to the level of, say, a breastfeeding mother, then you get the loss of libido almost entirely, and interest goes down. So whether that's in the pathway here, I think is still an open question. But yeah, I think it's totally reasonable to consider. I mean, if we took libido, paternal motivation, and testosterone, I mean, where are the causal arrows there? Is it testosterone driving down libido and increasing paternal motivation, or is paternal motivation driving down testosterone and maybe affecting libido in a way that allows men to be more effective partners and parents? I think it's a really legitimate perspective and question.
I hope this is just a really fast one. It's probably very obvious, but I am happy to hear that you're collaborating in this way for your future work, and that's really great to hear. I think my question is really about, in terms of looking at that family ecology, is there a provision for just plain old fatigue in there?
Oh, well, I can speak to that personally. I can also tell you that based on the preliminary data we have from my study with Julie and Mark, that I basically am just a high testosterone mother, because I can look at the distributions of the mothers and fathers' testosterone, and I'm on the high end of female T. So take that for what it is. but I'm really tired. So we try to control for sleep time and self-reported sleep quality. I will very quickly acknowledge that people are not very good at recalling their sleep time or their in sleep quality. It's a 5-point Likert scale. It's not all that useful. Julie and I actually have another grant under review at NICHD where if we were to get that, I would love to incorporate, say, actigraphy in terms of at-home kind of monitoring of mothers and fathers' sleep to see. We do know there's increasing research from sleep laboratories where they're doing polysomnography and things where they do sleep disruption, so they only let men sleep 4, 5, 6 hours a night, which I would be thankful to get at this point. And it affects their testosterone and kind of with effect sizes that are somewhat comparable to what we're documenting here. So I think that the sleep quality issue and the sleep time and the number of awakenings and how long you're awake are things that we haven't fully grappled with yet just because our data are limited.
And I am appreciative of that, and especially actigraphy as well, but at the same time, fatigue encompasses so many other components that are different from sleep as well. Sleep is a huge one. Yeah. I don't know how you measure that, but just saying, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, perhaps, that really just draws down a person's everything.
Yeah, no, I agree. And going to sleep, which I can kind of, well, potentially quantitatively measure in a more accessible way, immediately I think is where my line of thinking went. But
that's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah, again, I think part of my inclination, just conjecturing, is that, well, so low testosterone and fatigue is also part of that menopause model that actually is not well regulated and has no basis in the scientific literature. But if men are really exhausted and they're fatigued and they have low, if their testosterone's contributing there, I would think it's potentially contributing to them being more sensitive and nurturing in spite of fatigue. So potentially helping to facilitate positive kind of outcomes with their children in spite of all of the psychological, mental, physical challenges that we experience as parents of young infants.
Thank you very much.